everyone. I'm Michelle McCurdy. I'm one of the nurse practitioners from Student Health, our Student Health Clinic here on campus. And so part of our Healthy Lunch Bunch group today, we are going to discuss fats. So just bear with me. There's only about 8 slides in this brief presentation, but I'm going to go into some biochemistry just to give you all a big overview, and I promise it'll make sense and be helpful as we hit the latter part of this talk. Feel free to ask any questions. So without further ado, I'm just going to start with some very broad basic information about fats. All fats are equally fattening. So, whether we're talking about saturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats, all fats are equally fattening. So that is to say that they contain about 9 calories per gram. And for reference, a gram is about the weight of 3 raisins, okay? Another reference point is that if we think about proteins and carbohydrates, they carry about 4 calories per gram. So again, 9 calories per gram with fats, and then 4 calories per gram for proteins and carbohydrates. So this is why, fats are a bit more dangerous because they are higher in density in terms of calories. But as we'll talk about, they are absolutely essential. Fats are not bad, they're good. They turn bad when we have too many of them or too many of the wrong kind of fat. And we're going to talk about that in this brief talk here. So just to add a perspective, all foods contain fats, different types of fats, varying types of fats. There's no one type of food that only has one kind of fat. So when we talk about omega-3 fats and we say that, such and such a food, is high in omega-3 fats, walnuts are high in omega-3 fats. That's not to say that it doesn't have omega-6s or other types of fats. It's just to say that that is a predominant, it just happens to contain a high ratio of fats compared to other of omega-3s compared to other foods. So just as all foods also contain varying amounts of, protein and carbohydrate, it's the same with fats. So all foods contain some varying type of fat. And just for a baseline, about 30% on average of our diet should come from fat. So that's about 600 calories of a 2,000 calorie diet. And that equates to about 60 grams of fat per day. For reference, a hard-boiled egg has 80 calories and 5 grams of fat. Okay. About 10% of our 30% can come from saturated fat. The American Heart Association, prefers around 7%. And then the rest of, the fats come from other types, whether it's omega-3s, polyunsaturated fat, whatnot. Okay. All right. So having had that basic review of what we're going to discuss and where we are on fats, we'll just go to the next slide. And this is just to give you guys a broad overview, kind of a map of where we're going, because it is such a broad topic. And I don't know about you guys, but it's helpful for me to know exactly what I'm talking about, where do the fats that we're talking about fit in the broader scope of things. So fats are just a type of lipid, okay? And lipids basically are just complex compounds that don't mix well with water. So they're just categorized in this group. And within that group, we're going to be talking about fats. Now, there's also cholesterol. That's not something this, talk is going to cover. That's a whole separate issue. But cholesterol is a lipid, and it's made up of fats, as well as proteins. But I just wanted to reiterate that this is where cholesterol sits. It's sort of a separate category than the dietary fats that we're going to be talking about. Cholesterol, for example, is not used to store energy, for example, but fats are, as well as proteins and carbohydrates. They are macronutrients, and ways for us as human beings to extract energy. Okay, so triglycerides falls under that fat category. And just to give you an idea of what triglycerides essentially are, they are the predominant method in which we store fat. And they're a very basic component of the types of fats we consume. So when we think about our belly fat or the pinch and inch fat that we have on our bodies, that's basically triglycerides that are sitting there. So that's the kind of fat that we want to get rid of. Triglycerides are also in our blood, and that's one of the measurements we get when we get our cholesterol checked at the doctor's office. One of the measurements is looking at triglyceride counts. So that's sort of what triglycerides are and how they fit into this whole picture of lipids. And also excess calories that we take in, whether it's sugar or alcohol, those are stored as triglycerides in various parts of our body, whether it's, in our subcutaneous fat or in the liver, whether it's in our bloodstream. So that's sort of the bigger picture on that. Okay, next slide. So essentially we have 3 types of fats. And I know this slide looks scary, and maybe you guys are thinking back to chemistry and it's like, oh my God, why am I showing this? But I feel like it just gives you a perspective. And as we talk about these kinds of fats, you can, throughout the rest of this talk, you can kind of picture in your mind how these fats operate, why they do what they do, why they're important or not as important. So just bear with me here. And so the 3 basic types of fats, as you can see, is we have, unsaturated fats. And when we're talking about saturation, you can see the C's stand for the carbon atoms, for carbon. And so the carbon, as you can see, is linked to hydrogen. And there are areas where it's not linked to hydrogen. So you can see then that this is unsaturated. The saturation relates to hydrogen. So hydrogen ion is unsaturated with hydrogen ions. We are missing. You've got a double bond here between the carbon. So we're missing a couple hydrogen ions in this area, and it kind of causes a kink in the molecule. If we look at saturated fats, right, you can see there's no space between the atoms, and it is saturated with hydrogen. So we have hydrogen completely connected to all areas here, all the bonding to carbon. So, and then when we look at trans fat, it's not really saturated. As you can see, we do have some open spots for hydrogen, but it does function like a saturated fat, right? And why do you think that is, right? It's because there's a certain stability here. If you look at the shape versus this shape, there's a kink because we're missing some hydrogen atoms here. But we have a trans fat, which is trans being on opposite sides, right? The Latin root, trans. You've got the hydrogen on the opposite side, but that does create sort of a stability. So the trans fats, we've heard of those. Those are a type of unsaturated fat, and they behave like a saturated fat in terms of the structure, like I just mentioned. And so, because it behaves like it has this more rigid structure, it's more difficult to break apart. It's more stable. And that's why it's basically a manufactured fat. I mean, it does exist in animal products in very small amounts, but the vast majority, tiny, tiny amounts, the vast majority of trans fats, they are essentially manufactured fats, okay? So the reason why these are produced, were produced because they're cheap to produce. They help with shelf life. It's just a cheap way to make food creamy and extend shelf life. On the label, these trans fats are described as partially hydrogenated or hydrogenated. Hydrogenated meaning that these hydrogen ions have been added on or saturated, although like I said, this is not, a trans fat is not a saturated fat, but it does act like a saturated fat. Okay, so next slide. Just looking in a little bit deeper on the types of fats. We just looked at these three basic types: saturated fat, unsaturated fat, trans fats, and then the unsaturated fats then break down further into monounsaturated and polyunsaturated, right? So monounsaturated is there's one double bond in the carbon chain. So there's just one area that is not saturated with the hydrogen, right? Monounsaturated. Polyunsaturated, there's more than one double bond, right? There's more than one space for hydrogen. Omega-9s on here, you don't have to worry about those. We make those. It's not an issue. They don't have any major health benefits or anything like that. We don't have any problems obtaining omega-9s. It's just a type of monounsaturated fat, a common type of monounsaturated fat. Polyunsaturated fat, we have omega-3s and omega-6s. And just to give you a little bit of perspective, the omegas, I know you guys have heard these before, and just to help you understand what these mean, when we talk about omega-9, omega-3, omega-6, this number just refers to the first carbon in the chain that has a double bond. So the omega-3 is the third carbon, has a double bond. That's all that refers to. That's, so you can kind of brag to your friends at a party, that you know about this new, very cool information. Okay, so, monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats, they're both liquid at room temperature. And you can kind of figure out how that is if you look at the structure, right? Remember that the saturated fats and the trans fats have that structure that is a little bit more solid and stable, so that they are solid at room temperature. The mono and poly have a different structure. It's not as strong. So they tend to be liquid at room temperature. That's where your oils come in and whatnot. Let's see. Okay, so the polyunsaturated tends to be healthier than the monounsaturated, okay? So, because obviously the stronger the structure is, the less healthy it is, the less easily it is to be broken down. So if you can imagine that polyunsaturated has more than one area where the hydrogen is missing its seat at the table, so to speak. And so that makes it a little less structured, a little less rigid. Okay. All right, next slide. So let's just talk about, and I know you guys have heard many times this buzz term, essential fatty acids, essential fatty acids. You guys gotta have your essential fatty acids. So what all that means when we talk about essential fatty acids is that these are fats that we ourselves as human beings cannot produce on our own. We have to get these fats from our diet in order to survive, basically. And there's essentially two types of essential fatty acids. There's alpha linoleic acid and linoleic acid. Omega-3 and omega-6, all right? And remember omega-3, the way that structure is, there's a reason why it's a 3, is it's the third carbon that has the double bond. Omega-6 is the sixth carbon that has the double bond. Not that that's important, but just to kind of give you a reference point as to what we were talking about in the last slide. And these are different types of polyunsaturated fats, which are the healthier fats versus the monounsaturated fats. Just to refresh you from what we were talking about in the last slide there. So again, these are fats that the body cannot manufacture, that we need to get from food. And let's remember, right? I'm not sure if I talked about it in the beginning. I should have mentioned that in the very first slide. Duh. You know, fats are important, right? We need them. And why do we need them? What do they do? Well, they, you know, are the structure, provide the structure and function of all of our cells, you know, including nerve cells. They're precursors to hormones. So fats are extremely important. So the two types here, the omega-3, this type of fat is predominant in green leaves, in beans, specifically soybeans, and we've talked about that in the class about eating frozen edamames and thawing them and eating them as a delicious, easy snack. Nuts and seeds, specifically walnuts and flax seeds, are high in omega-3s. And fish, specifically salmon and sardines, those are particularly high in omega-3s. And then we have linoleic acid, okay? That's an omega-6. We don't really have any problem getting omega-6. The linoleic acid is present in animal products. So, you know, unless you are a vegan, you know, and don't eat enough, watch your diet and don't eat enough healthy fruits and vegetables, you're not going to have an issue with getting linoleic acid. It's meats, dairy, eggs, all have linoleic acid. So we need these two fats, alpha linoleic acid or AA and linoleic acid or LA. And from these are derived these other fats that you know that you can see on here. EPA, it's not really important to talk about exactly, you know, what it's called, and DHA. And then from omega-6, we get GLA and AA, which stands for arachidonic acid, okay? So, and you've probably heard, you know, it's of supplements, EPA and DHA ratio supplements. And if you haven't now, you're probably going to recognize that when you go look at supplements. So basically our health depends largely on the balance of these two types, okay? And I think you can imagine, right? Which one do we as Americans have a hard time getting? Alpha linoleic acid or linoleic acid, if we're considering the sources of these types of fats, right? So clearly omega-3s, right? We do not eat enough green leaves, beans, nuts, seeds, you know, fish. Sometimes we're pretty good at with fish, perhaps. But a lot of the green leafy stuff, we're just not so great at. So omega-3s are a really, it's really important for us to focus on trying to get as much of these as possible. These foods also have omega-6 in them. So it's not like we're not going to get omega-6 foods, omega-6 fats if we don't eat, you know, meat products. And so an important thing to understand then, as we look at this chain of events, and I apologize because I know this is a really boring slide, but it's just the really basic way for us to understand how important these fats are and how they operate in our body. The problem is, now you can imagine, if we don't get enough of our alpha linoleic acid, if we're not having enough, you know, vegetables, greens, beans, seeds, all that good healthy stuff, you can imagine if we're not getting enough here, then we're not going to get enough of our EPA and we're not going to get enough of our DHA, right? The rest of that chain is going to be a bit sparse, right? Same goes for here, although like I said, we don't generally have any problem with this piece of the chain here. If we look at a really important fat here, when we're looking at this chain, is DHA, okay? And It's basically what DHA does in our body. It's used to produce anti-inflammatory mediators. And they, one of the main functions it is they inhibit abnormal immune function, right? And so then they prevent things like excessive blood clotting, heart disease, autoimmune disorders, skin problems, depression, arthritis, anxiety probably as well, cancer, etc. A lot of our modern diseases, right? So now with the omega-6, just switch to that area briefly. Again, it's really ubiquitous in our modern diet. It's everywhere. And what happens then is that this chain is plentiful, and it leads to quite a bit of this AA. It's not Alcoholics Anonymous, it's arachidonic acid, okay? And the problem with AA is it does its job, it's fine, it has a role, but if we have too much of it, then we end up promoting, it tends to promote an unhealthy type of inflammation, okay? And this increase of inflammation can then go on to cause the health problems I mentioned just a little bit ago: high blood pressure, blood clots, allergies, arthritis, depression. Inflame those. And even beyond that, to make matters worse, the arachidonic acid goes on to decrease the production of DHA. And you know why that is? It's because they compete for the same resources in the body, primarily the enzymes in the body. And so that's generally what happens. And we end up with more of this. We end up with this imbalance in our bodies that then results in us having these modern health conditions that we see today. Okay, so we're pretty much done with all the heavy duty stuff, but this is just sort of a good foundation in terms of fats and where we are. So again, what fats should we eat most, right? What should we try to focus on? Because our diets are so heavy in animal products. And that is foods high in omega-3s, right? And these foods are high in omega-3s. We've got walnuts, berries, hemp seeds, leafy greens, winter squash, beans, vegetables, flax seeds, edamames, chia seeds. So those are foods that we really need to try to eat more of. Okay, let's see, let's move on. Now, how much omega-3 fat should we add to the diet? Generally, like 2 to 3 grams a day, okay? So that would equal, if you wanted to say, hey, Michelle, how can I what's an easy way for me to add that into my diet? And so these are just some easy ways right here. Flax seeds, you can have 1 tablespoon is 1.7 grams. You can just get a nice heaping tablespoon of that and have enough. I usually get flax seeds. I get ground flax seeds at Trader Joe's. Trader Joe's is not paying me for any of this, just so you know, full disclosure. That's where I shop because I find the prices to be cheaper and it's smaller and easier for me to shop there. And flax seeds are great. I mean, it has this very mild, nutty flavor. I add it to everything. I put it on salads. I put it on yogurt. I put it on my oatmeal every morning. I just have this routine where I have my oatmeal with my raisins and walnuts, and I add a nice heaping tablespoon of flaxseed onto the top of that with some bananas. And that's it, and it fills me up and I'm not hungry for a really long time. So another one is walnuts. You can have 12 halves of walnuts, and that equals about 2 grams of omega-3 fats. Soybeans, 1.5 cups of soybeans. And so I mentioned before, just getting the edamames, frozen edamames, I like those, and just, thaw them in the microwave. And it's a really nice, super easy, delicious, fulfilling snack. And then tofu is the last one listed on here. Just 1.5 cups of tofu will do it. And there's many different ways to prepare tofu. We'll talk about those kinds of different ways in class at some point. We have plenty of time. And so just one final piece here. This is the last slide. When looking for healthy fats, this is just one takeaway. Just opt for, this is why when, there's a lot of buzz out there about whole foods. And this is wise because anytime you have an oil, that's basically a refined, you're just taking a piece of that food out, right? Just like when you look at an apple and you squeeze the apple and you get the juice, you're getting a concentrated food. And that is going to be very concentrated, high in calories. It doesn't have the fiber, so you're not going to feel full. And so the same goes for oils. There's olive oils, they're healthy, but they still have a lot of calories, right? Even these healthy oils that we talk about, you can't just have as much as you want. And if we look, our stomach holds about 1 liter, right? And if you take 400 calories of oil, are you going to really feel full? You're going to have the same amount, you're going to have 400 calories, but you're going to be hungry and you're going to end up filling the rest of your stomach with more calories. You're going to end up eating a lot more and taking on, taking on more weight because of it, right? So if you compare that to 400 calories of chicken, that's a little bit better, but you're still not going to feel satisfied. And then you're going to end up reaching for that ice cream for dessert, for instance, right? Whereas if you look at 400 calories of vegetables, the amount of fiber, and that's really the key here, is to have plenty of fiber. And that's what enables us to feel full, is that fiber. That's a really big part of that. And that's what so much of our American diet is missing, is that fiber. You can really feel full, really feel satisfied. And I know, I know what you guys are thinking. Well, I'll eat a whole bowl of vegetables, a whole big salad, and I'm just still starving afterwards. And it's just important for us to be able to tell the difference and realize, right, that, just like anything else, there is an addiction component to food. And we've talked in previous sessions here about the different types of eating. And there is a certain type of addiction. And just like with alcohol or, any sort of drugs, you're going to go through this withdrawal process where if once you change your eating, right, you're going to feel a sense of withdrawal because your body is not getting what it's used to getting, right? So you're going to feel hungry. And there's a difference between hunger and craving, right? So it's important for us. And that's where, when we've talked about mindfulness in the past, this is just, sit and think, am I really hungry? Or this is just a craving, right? And as we've talked in the past, it just takes about 90 seconds for most time on average for us to for that craving to pass. It tends to be a temporary feeling. So just give yourself 90 seconds, distract yourself, do something else. And most of the time, we'll forget about it. So the other piece of this is taste, right? Because you'll have, a big bowl of, salad, and you'll be like, oh, this really doesn't taste like much. Well, there's another piece to that, right? If we are, for example, our taste buds are so overpowered with all of the processed foods we eat that tend to be really heavy in salt, right? So think of it like being outside, in the bright sunlight, and suddenly you go inside into a cave and it's dark and you can't see anything, right? And after a few minutes, your eyes start to adjust and you can see. So think about your taste buds doing the same thing, right? They've been bombarded with all of this rich, heavy, salty, fatty foods. And then suddenly you have a salad. It's not going to be nearly as satisfying, right? So you have to be patient with yourself and you have to give yourself time to adjust. And for everybody, it's a little bit different, but, within a week, and it gets better after that. you will develop some, you'll actually, the food will taste even better. You'll be able to really discern the difference between, if you have butter in there, you'll be able, oh my God, this has butter in it, whereas we just have so much butter in our food right now that we don't even taste it anymore, right? So so just be patient with yourself, and these are just baby steps. Look to make one small change at a time, 1 week at a time, or whatever time frame works for you. But the important thing is that you're educating yourself and you're moving in the right direction. And it's just important to be kind to yourself in this process, and find support. If it's not here with us, in this group, find support with friends, you know in your own community, whatever works for you. But we're here for you in the meantime. Anyway, so that's basically concludes our talk on fats. Questions, if you have any, and then just quick list of resources. All right. Thanks, everybody.